Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. This podcast, as I have said many times, aims to tackle all things cerebral cortex, and even within that prefrontal cortex. And our hope, my mission, my goal is to really tackle this complex topic in three ways. One is to kind of really understand and do a deep dive in executive function, the self-regulation, the capacity to introspect, and to actually be able to make changes change your ways, change yourself through introspection. The second is to really understand the research, and this research keeps coming and informing us, and to bring that and translate that into everyday life. And lastly, can we influence other people? We are in charge of other people, and sometimes we are just living with people who need a lot of change, but we might have this little confidence that we can change people, and we need to really take a look at that. So today I get a chance to talk about that. But before I tell you about that, I had a great story. Over the weekend, I went for a walk with my girlfriend, and she and I, we both have kids who are very close friends, and she proceeded to tell me a story about her friend, her son's girlfriend. And the son's girlfriend is from England, and she happened to call her parents one afternoon. It was, Sunday afternoon in England, around 2:00, and apparently she was trying to FaceTime, and the parents were in the middle of a little squabble. And the topic of squabble was dinner time. And father wanted to have dinner at 5:30 so that he could have a pint of beer with his dinner. And his mom was outraged and protested that we are not geriatric a couple to eat that early. She preferred that they started dinner at 7. And then dad got upset because he felt if he started dinner at 7, then pint of beer would make an impact on his bladder control, and he will have to get up in the middle of the night. And all this went down when the daughter had just called to say hello. So the daughter chuckled and said, "That's another ordinary day at Wilson's house." What was so cute about that, the parents were comfortable enough to fight, but the fight, of course, was a little empty. There was a lot of negotiating happening through that squabble. So bicker, squabble, argue, wrangle, fight, disagree, dispute, spar, lock horns are some of the things we do when we are in a relationship with someone that we deeply care. Without the full well knowledge of the psychological science behind it, however, it's hard to know if these behaviors and approaches to conflict resolution are normal or even healthy. Executive function is a key ingredient in regulating emotions, thoughts, and actions as we navigate relationships and engage in help-seeking and help-giving behaviors. And that's why I am going to have this wonderful guest share his wisdom with us. Because in my practice, I see children, adolescents, and adults with the diagnosis of ADHD who suffer from symptoms that range from diminished attention span, impulsivity, lack of sensitivity regarding how one's own behaviors impact others. And as I know such type of emotional and behavioral dysregulation can negatively affect family relationships, friendships, friendship making, and even marital harmony. So with United States, 3 to 11% of children are being reported to have been diagnosed with ADHD, and 30 to 50% of child referrals for mental health services are attributed to ADHD. Investigating best ways to improve interpersonal relationship is definitely valuable so that we can improve executive function and also improve relationships. So with that in mind, it's a great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Gary Lewandowski Jr., who is an award-winning teacher, researcher, writer, and a relationship expert. He's a professor at Monmouth University, the author of Stronger Than You Think, The 10 Blind Spots That Undermine Your Relationships, and How to See Past past them. He's a co-author of an innovative research method text, Discovering the Scientist Within, and he has written one more book, so co-authored with another of his colleagues. His work has been featured by Washington Post, Daily Mail, Business Insider, Salon, and the New Republic, and many more, including my favorite, The Atlantic. And his TED Talk, Breakups Don't Have to Leave You Broken, have been viewed 2 million times. And that's just the beginning, I think. So welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great, Sucheta. Thank you so much for having me.
So, you wrote about 10 myths that sabotage our relationships and our love life, and you have gifted the world with some practical science backed tools that act more like a microscope and binoculars to introspect our relationships' hidden strengths. If harnessed, that can help us build deeply meaningful and long lasting relationships. So, how did you end up studying relationships?
I mean, it actually goes back all the way to college. When I was a college student, I was a psychology major, and I thought, like a lot of psychology majors, I was going to be a clinician because I wanted to help people. I was the friend that everyone else sought out for advice and wisdom, and as an 18-year-old, I had none of those things, but people sought it out nonetheless. So I thought for sure, being a clinician was the way to go. But then my junior year into my senior year, I had an internship where I quickly realized that it was not the way to go for me. I was a little bit too focused on immediate impacts, and that it's a field where your immediate wins are not going to be as plentiful as perhaps you would hope. Particularly at that time of my life, I was 20 at the time. I was not patient enough to kind of be a clinician and sort of play the long game, I think. And so I met with my academic advisor, and I kind of brought to her my dilemma. Like, I thought I was going to be a clinician, and I just can't do this. I just don't see over the long haul that, I'm going to be able to have this kind of impact on people the way I want to. And she said, okay, yeah, it's good. It's good to know what you don't want to do, which is actually really profound advice. And so she said, well, what is it that you like to think about? Psychology is a broad field. Like, what do you enjoy? Like, well, I was a 20-year-old male college student, so relationships. And I kind of flippantly said, relationships, but you can't study that. like that's not a real topic. And she said, no, you can study that, and people do. And there's this whole science to it. And it was just like, it's like you have those moments in life where like the whole, like, you're so ignorant without even knowing it. And then all of a sudden somebody like says some things that now it just immediately seems so obvious. And at the same time, it had never been revealed before. It's like, oh, yeah, that's exactly what I want to study. And so I've been doing that for the last 20 plus years.
Well, brilliant. Thank you. So before we visit a few myths, I think 10, we might have to bring you back, and because it's just fantastic. But can you start us off with the human plight, our insufferable self-blindness? You say, and I quote you, that one of the biggest obstacles we face when trying to see our relationship clearly is that we give ourselves a lot of credit for how much insight and self-awareness we have about our own lives. Problem is that the credit is unwarranted. So why do you say that?
Well, it's certainly true. I mean, we think we know ourselves a lot better than we actually do. It turns out we don't actually spend that much time thinking about ourselves. And even when we're given the opportunity to think about ourselves, there's a study where participants were brought in and they were given the opportunity to basically, the gift of time. Like we always say, we just need more time to do certain things. And so they were given that gift. They were told, you can sit here for 20 minutes and think about yourself. Or if you'd rather, you can give yourself electrical shocks, which they had all agreed, they had experienced these earlier and had all agreed that these were painful. But so now they had a choice of they could sit here and think about themselves for 20 minutes or give themselves electrical shocks. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. Yet 40% chose the shocking path of let's give myself electrical shocks, which, just kind of goes to show that, we like to think we know who we are, but we don't. But part of the reason why is it's a little bit threatening. We don't really want to kind of dig into what's going on with ourselves. Yet when it comes to relationships, we're really defensive about that in the sense that we really believe that we know what's best for ourselves. And yet, there's been other research done where, researchers have asked people in relationships, what's your relationship future look like? Like, how's this relationship going to turn out? How happy you're going to be? Those types of questions. But they also asked their roommate and their mom. And so the roommate and the mom, were asked the same questions, what is their future going to look like? And they basically said, that's a tough question. I don't really know, but here's my guess. And then so they tracked those participants over time. And what they found was the most confident person was the person in the relationship themselves, because it was their relationship. They knew how this was going to turn out, right? They absolutely knew. Mom and the roommate, not so confident, but who was the most accurate? Roommate was number one. Mom was number two. The least accurate person was yourself. And so we ourselves have this really deadly combination of supreme confidence in what turned out to be the least accurate information. And so that's a problem. And so, a lot of times we just really don't know what we don't know. And we fall back too much on our experience, but we have to realize experience isn't the same thing as expertise. As many relationships as you've had as an individual, it pales in comparison to the number of relationships that us as relationship scientists get access to in any one study. And so, if you want to set yourself up for success and essentially play the odds, to put the odds in your favor in terms of, what's most likely to work out for long-term relationship stability and happiness, you have to side with science.
I really like the way you set up the book as myths and then providing some lens how that is a myth and not reality, and then giving some advice, because I can see, I've seen a lot of self-help books which are kind of give tips. And the problem with the tips is, my experience having given tips to people, is they certify themselves to be fabulous. And they say, I already use it. And so if you set it up, which doesn't lead to introspection, because strategy is almost looks like a choice, but beliefs looks like I don't question my wrongness until I'm challenged or until I'm nudged. So one thing that, let's start with the men and women difference that you talk about. You said the first assumption you bust is, I quote, the scientific evidence overwhelmingly shows that men and women are from the same planet. So where did we all go wrong to make such a strong assumption, and how does that get us off track from seeking and enjoying healthy relationships?
Yeah, part of, I appreciate that you kind of noticed this idea about the tips, because, people don't like to admit when they're wrong. And so really the way that I set up each of these myths in the chapter is to kind of, show why you might have thought what you thought. And then, kind of use that as a foot in the door a little bit to kind of then show, like, here's how it's not exactly correct. And then not only that, like, everybody fundamentally wants to get it right. Relationships are so important to so many things, right? You want to be a good parent, you want to have a good relationship, right? I mean, everything's kind of is that fundamental. So you start that way. But then, kind of show people how to fix it. And so it's the same thing with the, difference between men and women. We tend to think there are these extreme differences between men and women because we are kind of pre-programmed to notice differences. And so if you want to go looking for differences between men and women, you will find them, right? There are some differences that exist. They happen to be primarily really obvious and easy to see ones, right? Our appearance, how we dress, physical characteristics and qualities and proficiencies. You look at hobbies, like who likes scrapbooking? It's women. It's not men, right? I mean, you can find these huge differences. And so if you're already going into it predisposed to believe there are these differences, you adopt this confirmation bias and you have ample evidence, right, at your disposal to say, look at this, they really are different. But we oversimplify things, right? And it's one of the gravest problems that we have as humans, and where psychology and science really try to fight back against that, is that we oversimplify, and so we think when we see some difference, it means everything's different, and yet the research overwhelmingly, and I even write this somewhere in the book where it's like I share meta-analyses and meta-syntheses, but it's like combining hundreds and hundreds of studies. And I even have this like throwaway line because there was so much more I could have included. And I just got sick of finding the same thing over and over when I did my research for the book. Basically just say, there's tons more. I mean, I could include it all, but it all says the same thing, which is men and women are overwhelmingly the same. right? I mean, our similarities far outweigh our differences. If you want to look for differences, they're there, but they tend to be small. Even the differences that we think like, oh, men are much less into communication and relationships than women. Okay, you can find true, significant, real differences between men and women on that dimension. They're real, but they're real small.
Very tiny.
Yeah, they're real small. And so, we make too much out of those small differences, which you kind of asked, why is that such a problem? Well, if you're in a heterosexual relationship, similarity brings people together. Differences drive people apart. And so the more you believe you're fundamentally different from your partner
Yes.
in any way, right, then it's just going to, it creates divides.
You know what's so neat about the way that you shared that is, one, I remember I was 2 years into my marriage, and I bought this Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus book. And I remember we had gone for a long trip across the country, and I was reading this book out loud to my husband, who cannot pay attention to any spoken word when he's driving. He hates that to be read, okay? And I was reading about how he's getting me wrong and how he doesn't understand me. And I'm like smothering him with this newly found knowledge, which was a terrible way to even communicate or negotiate that space with him. And finally, what it did to me is kind of confirmed my bias about how he cannot do certain things, and how it certified me to say, see, told you so. And now that I read that book, there were so many similarities. For example, I'll give you a quick story. So my husband and I, we both grew up in India, and it's considered a love marriage. That means it was not an arranged marriage. We met in college. But he was a medical student. I was a speech language pathology student. And anyway, there's this long backdrop of how we got together. But my birthday was coming up. My birthday is in October, and his is in December. And he made a card, a 3D card. A card was a big, like he had to carry it into the department, my speech language pathology department. And the card had a beautiful poem. It had like a constructed road with a car with his name and a speed breakers, which is a speech pathology, analogy. I would not have ever imagined my husband to be so romantic and so creative, because he was not only a brilliant thinker, but he was very cut and dry. If you talk to him, he would like science kind of thinking. And I never thought he would be so adorable and artsy, first of all. And then I made a card that was also three-dimensional. And so then that led us to we talking to each other instead of meeting every day, but writing letters to each other. And the last letter that we wrote to each other was 30-page long. So this relationship was based on a writing that went on for 8 months, when we met every day, but we wrote letters to each other for 8 months. I would have never imagined that to be that kind of person, my husband, or that young man, because he just had no signs, just if I relied on the way he spoke, that he was capable of doing those things, which is what you talk about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually a perfect example for one of the primary myths that surrounds men and women is, you ask people who's more romantic about relationships. Is it men or is it women? And it turns out it's men. And it's this exact kind of thing. Like men tend to be more romantic in this way. And particularly in the way of, believing that love will conquer all. They're more likely to believe in love at first sight. Whereas, women, on the other hand, are much more pragmatic. You ask people who falls in love more easily. Is it men or women? And people tend to mispredict that it's women that fall in love more easily, when in fact, the research shows men fall in love more easily.
That's unbelievable.
But, it just goes to show we don't know what we don't know.
We literally don't know what we don't know. And so then your message is that relationships are hard. And what we often get wrong is that they shouldn't take any work or take minimal work. Particularly when it comes to fantasizing true love. And another thing, wonderful thing you say is true love should be perfect and effortless is a myth. Why is this a myth? And can you share with us some of the barriers this myth creates?
Sure. I mean, it kind of ties in really nicely with this idea of being overly romantic towards relationships, right? And so when we watch movies or read books, like there's this idea of like, when two people are meant to be, it just is kind of everything's magical and it goes together and it's seamless and it's effortless. And I mean, it sounds great, but you actually have never had that kind of relationship with almost anyone in your life. The people you're closest to, you think like of your parents, your siblings, your very best friends. Nothing is perfect and easy and effortless because people have their own opinions. People are their own individuals. And so, it would be boring in some ways if you were so incredibly similar that, you'd have this frictionless kind of, interwoven experience. But I mean, the fact is, even with your own self, you kind of debate and struggle and argue with yourself in some ways. And so it's just it's this nice idea that sometimes we carry too far. And it's nice to kind of think that we can find someone who's our perfect match because that sounds like something we should want. And it's possibly a harmless belief, but if you start using that as the criteria by which to judge the quality of your current relationship, you're trying to live up to this unattainable standard. And that's, one of the fundamental messages behind the book and the title of the book, Stronger Than You Think, is that people have all these myths and what I call blind spots, and they don't even know they have them, first of all, and then they don't realize how what seems innocent and or helpful for many people, most people think these things are helpful, are actually making you think your relationship is worse than it is, which is the opposite of what anybody really wants to have happen. And so, it's really a shame. And it just, again, kind of goes to, I tell students that take my class all the time, is like, I don't know if there's a more important class you could take in college than a course about relationships, because it's going to impact every day of the rest of your life.
The part that was really striking to me is that I had a researcher, Tony Atwood, who is an autism expert, and he was talking about that a lot of, if you talk about autism spectrum as a atypical, then you have neurotypical women are attracted to men on the spectrum, and they take them on as a fixer-upper project, and they fail miserably because it's a desire to change somebody who lacks fundamental social communication ability because of the, let's say, not able to theorize the minds of others kinds of struggles. But women tend to consider that they can be a motivational inspiration. Honey, all you got to do is wear a different color shirt and different pants and talk less and talk more and just do you see that this kind of partnership improvement project that we all take on is more done by one gender over the other? And what are some of the challenges of doing that? Because there's an expectation that if you really love me, then you would not be hesitant to change yourself.
Right. Yeah. And ironically, it's the opposite, right? If you really love me, you wouldn't need me to change. You would love me for who I am.
Oh, yes.
And so, I think people do, approach relationships too often in terms of they want a project. They kind of want to take this person and shape them into this wonderful person who's ideal for them. And so, as much as we all kind of want to be that, reveal your inner Chip and Joanna Gaines and be a fixer upper and really like try to like turn this thing into this wonderful outcome. It's really presumptuous. So first of all, it's presumptuous in the sense that you think you know what's best for that person.
Yes.
I know what's better for you. I know you need to do this. It's also presumptuous. Autism is in that kind of, your example is a little bit on the more extreme because you have neurological reasons why someone's not going to change likely. But in other cases, we're talking, people want to make a fundamental change to their partner's personality. Personality is really reluctant to change. Personality is largely stable. Worse, it gets more and more stable as you get older and older. And so, if you're 20 years deep into your relationship and now you're hoping that you're going to mold, shift, and cajole your partner into, this new and improved self, you're setting yourself up for failure. So let's just assume you really do know what's best. your partner wants to do it. Having a partner who wants to change who they are also isn't a great sign, because it means that they're not so sure about who they are, which, while they might be willing to change, the fact that they're so unsure about who they are comes with a whole other host of problems. Let's say, oh, that's fine. Now, how do you go about changing your partner? Right? So what's the implementation look like? And what the research shows is that even if you think you have a good plan, and even if your partner thinks you have a good plan, most of the time your implementation is poor, where what you're doing is nagging,
Yes.
insulting, cursing. You're showing signs of irritation and frustration, and you're doing all these tricks to try to motivate them to change. And it's all stuff that is really off-putting and shouldn't be the kinds of things someone who's your best friend, who loves you, who respects you, it's not the kind of thing they should be doing, right?
Yes.
And so that's usually what the problem is. One last piece of this. Even if you know that the nagging, complaining route is wrong, and I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do it the right way and just compliment them and be nice to them when they do all the things I like, and then just kind of ignore all the bad behavior. Like a good behavior analyst, right? It's like you're just going to reward the good and ignore the bad. That's better, right? But it's still affection. It's with strings attached.
Yes.
And so that's still, the ideal in a relationship is unconditional love. Like I should love you for who you are and not for who I want you to be. And that's where, this idea of changing you for the better, like I said when I started, it's extremely presumptuous, and it's usually destined to fail.
That chapter reminded me of the play I saw in 90s, which is called I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change. And that play was exactly based on this idea that I think, I get it that you like me, I like you, I love you, fine. But there's so many more ways you can fit to my ideal version of who I am with. So what I got out of that chapter, that one is there is an incredible urgency with which we try to control other person. And second, there's a genuine lack of acceptance for who the other person is. So there is a kind of a rejection built into this kind of love. This is a love with string attached, but it's also a little critical love. So can that be a really love is the question we should be asking. And lastly, I'll say, and I don't know what you think about this, but this to me is also applicable to not your most intimate love, but even parental love. There is so much expectation of change is built into the way parents relate to their children, that yeah, honey, you're perfect, but you just need to do this more, this less, and then you can become more desirable. So are these principles applicable to all relationships, or do they more hold true for most intimate ones?
I think all of them. I think it's really hard for one person to be the source of knowledge and truth for someone else's life, right? No two people are the same. And so as much as you like to think,
Yes.
I have a daughter, she's 13, going to be 14, as much as there's certain things, like you kind of want to overlay your life experience and hopes and dreams onto them, which is fundamentally unfair because those were yours. And when your parents tried to do that to you, you knew how that felt. It felt like they were rejecting you. They didn't accept you for who you are, like all the things we were just talking about. And so we tend to forget that when we're in the role and we have more control, like it just seems like, no, honey, we know best. We know best. And it's like sometimes, you have to let people be who they are and accept them for who they are. And it's actually something I talk about in this chapter a little bit, which can apply to parenting too, is like, every chapter kind of shows like the problem. Like you don't want to think about changing your partner and all the reasons I just described, but like there's the better way. And so the better way is relationships should change you. So that sounds like that's completely opposite of what I just said, but your relationship should change you in the way you yourself want to change. And so my partner isn't there to guide my change.
That.
My partner is there to help me change in the direction I want to go. And so that's the kind of support that relationship partner should provide. And so, as a relationship partner, whatever my wife wants to do to improve herself, my job is to stand back, support, cheerlead, you go. Like anything I can do to kind of help facilitate her direction of what she has chosen. Not for me to say, you know what, I know you want to go do this, but this would be better for you. And so, a lot of this relationship stuff, there's nuance to it. And so, at some points it can kind of seem like, both sides are, you're arguing the same thing on both sides. But I think it's the same with, being a parent too. You have to kind of take a step back. And as much as it can be frustrating because they're not choosing what you would have chosen, you had your chance, you chose your things. Now it's their turn. And you just kind of do what you can to support them.
And, that reminds me of the concept from mindfulness contemplative studies is that non-judgmental presence, how to be there strongly rooted in values, strongly rooted in love, but giving the freedom and no leash so that the person who is doing the self-exploration has the courage to do so because they're not doing it for you. They're doing it for themselves because they have a secure tie to you where you have shown them how much you love them and accept them. Wow. Well, how many relationships do you know like that? Is this fantasy or is this something happens without work? Doesn't it require work?
I think it requires work, and I think it requires insight. And I think, a lot of times left to your own devices, as we discussed earlier, it's tough to find that insight on your own. And that's where you need to take a class, read a book, listen to a podcast. Any one of those things can kind of, give you that shift in perspective. I have a quote in the book that says, a shift in perspective is worth 80 IQ points. And that's true in all kinds of things, but particularly with your relationship, because we kind of get into these ruts in relationships where we're doing what we have seen our friends do. We're doing what we've seen our parents do. We're doing what we've seen on, God forbid, television. And so, we don't really know any better because we're kind of living in this little relationship bubble. And so, the great thing is, teaching a class on this, I get to, look out at a bunch of people and I give talks too. And you kind of see like people come in with all these assumptions. And as they get these new perspectives, you can just see the IQs. You can see like their face. Oh my gosh. And so you need things every once in a while to kind of, get you out of your relationship ruts, I think.
It's interesting. So executive function training is nothing but perspective building and expanding your worldview. So it's the deck of your experiential knowledge about how to respond differently to novel circumstances in unpredictable situations and during uncertainty, but also to sit with the discomfort that comes from having to witness somebody who's not doing things the way you want them. So can you talk a little bit about emotions and role of emotions in handling and building strong relationships when without victimizing yourself, or definitely drawing the line when other person's behaviors are inappropriate, but kind of developing this incredible tolerance for different ways that your husband or wife does things or your children do it? I'll give you a quick example. we have a lady who comes and helps my mom, who is 78, and she lives with us. And so we have somebody who comes and helps us during the day when my husband and I are gone. And so she loaded the dishwasher in a particular way. And dishwasher is a classic telltale about your relationship, I feel, what the other spouse does. So my husband, of course, so I came home first. And so she said, I'm leaving. And I said, no problem. She said, the dishwasher is not loaded correctly, but Anant will fix it. So my husband will fix it. I looked, I did not even bother to open it because I know he's going to fix it. Even if I fixed it, he would fix it. The minute he came home, we both take lunch to work, and he brought his lunchbox. He emptied it out. He opened the dishwasher, and then he dropped everything and he reloaded the dishwasher. So we just realized this is something I have come to terms with, that he needs to do this. How much ever masterfully I load the dishwasher is never going to be adequate. But why would I try to impress him with my dishwasher loading skills when he got it? So I walk away and he can do it. So tell me a little bit about that emotion of discomfort or anger or frustration we feel when dealing with other person is literally having to deal with their deck of different ways of thinking and being. And existing, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what you're describing is one of those things that we call relationship work. There's lots of different things you do kind of,
Yes.
sometimes, you clearly realize it. So this one is, in front of the scenes, but sometimes it's really behind the scenes that you're doing these little things that make the relationship work. And so, if that's the kind of thing that matters to your husband, then he just kind of takes care of it and you don't have to worry about it. And you kind of divide and conquer that way. And a lot of it has to do with just kind of picking your battles. I mean, there's lots of things you can be frustrated with, but sometimes there's just going to be these little quirks about your partner, and rather than think of it as a bug, right, in their programming, maybe it's a feature. Maybe it's just something that's kind of unique and adorable about them, that they have this, dishwasher Tetris kind of way of doing things where they take over.
Yes.
And rather than finding it like annoying and obsessive, and I admire a good dishwasher setup myself, and so my wife does not, and so we have the same kind of situation, and so it just rather than saying anything, I'm just like, okay, whatever, that's funny that this is all this, and it just kind of fix things, and you just kind of move on. And so this is what it's like living with anybody. Right. I mean, it's like it's living with your spouse. It's like this living with a teenager. And there's just certain things you worry about and certain things you don't, because if you worry about everything, you're attempting to control everything. And when you try to control everything, you're going to be eternally frustrated and annoyed. And that's not a way to live.
Love
sure.
that. And the last myth I think maybe we can visit in the given time frame we have is it's wrong to be selfish in a relationship. And you say that's a myth because more self work you do, more investment you make in taking the time away by yourself and on yourself is not a bad investment. Can you talk a little bit about this concept and also the theory that you and your colleagues propose about the self-expansion? Because I just love that concept and how beautifully you have weaved in really how the layers, the way I saw, the way I interpreted that, it's almost like a diamond that gets comes out of the rough and undergoes this mechanism of developing this multiple facets, and more exposure to a higher heat, more facets you build, greater the sparkle, I guess. So talk to us about that.
I like that. I like that, the diamond analogy. I think that's very appropriate. I think, a lot of these myths and blind spots come from these beliefs that have kind of been passed down, and, these overly romantic beliefs, romanticized beliefs. And so this one is really about this idea that, to have a good relationships are all about sacrifice. You must kind of forego your own impulses for the good of your relationship, for the good of your partner. And now, to be sure, relationships do require some sacrifice, but it shouldn't be this thing where, people kind of take it too far and think you're not allowed to do things for yourself. And then if you're doing things for yourself, it somehow means you're neglecting the relationship, or you're not being faithful to the relationship in some ways. And so, it's the research shows, I mean, when we make a lot of sacrifice, right, it makes us more committed. It builds a stronger bond, but it doesn't necessarily make us happier. So now being more committed sounds great, but not being as happy, why do you want to be more bonded to something that doesn't make you as happy? Now, you want to think like, well, why does it not make you happy? Well, it does on the days that you aren't experiencing any stress. But I don't know about you, I don't experience many of those days. And most people don't, right? So, that's atypical to have a stress-free day. But the bigger problem is that for every 10 things you do to sacrifice for your partner only sees 5 of them, right? So they're missing 50% of what you're doing for them. And so now you're doing all these things for them. They're not picking up on most of it. It becomes a real recipe for resentment. And so it turns out it's kind of fundamentally the wrong way to approach it anyway, is that your job isn't always to make all these sacrifices for your partner. Your job is to kind of, be an independent person who's looking out for yourself and your partner. If your partner's doing the same, you're not going to require all this sacrifice, because you're both going to kind of let each other load the dishwasher however you want. right? And you kind of like you step back and get out of the way and let people just kind of be who they are. The amount of sacrifice isn't as necessary. Um, and then so in that chapter, it kind of goes into the biggest mistake people make is this, what I call sacrifice's fatal flaw, is that a lot of times when we say you can't be selfish, we neglect the self. Yourself and who you are is everything. And much of the research I've done is on this idea of, as you mentioned, self-expansion. Self-expansion is this idea that we all have this fundamental motivation to grow and improve our sense of self. We basically want to become better people, and we want to become better people so that we're more capable of accomplishing new things. We want to, feel more able to tackle challenges. We seek out new, interesting, challenging, and exciting activities. And so we want to grow. And for relationships, our relationship partners are one of the fundamental ways that we do that. And we do that by getting close to our partner. We do it by spending time together with our partner. But one of the really interesting things about the research that we find is that as much as you can self-expand and grow your sense of self in your relationship, you can also do it on your own. Now, a lot of times people will feel guilty for, going off to go hang out with their friends instead of spending a night with their partner, or go golfing instead of hanging out with their partner. And there's like a guilt that is associated with that because it feels like selfish. Like I should be doing more for my partner. But what the research shows is when you go and do things on your own and self-expand and bolster your sense of self, it spills over to the relationship. You now have more experiences to bring into the relationship to share with your partner. So even if your partner goes on a business trip to some city that you've never been to, and it seems like, oh my gosh, they get to do that, it's not fair, they come back with all this new information and stories and experiences and as you said before, different perspectives that they now get to share with you. And because your partner experienced it and you're so close to them, it almost feels like you yourself experienced it, and that builds yourself, right? That expands yourself. And we know from lots of research, the more you broaden and build these positive emotions, it just kind of spills over into all kinds of other things.
And it's just such a fantastic way to present the opportunity to do some self-work, but it's not done because there's something lacking, but it's a natural trajectory of self to maintain this journey of, growing, I guess. You grow because you're changing, and you change, and that's how you grow. And one thing I can tell from my experiences, in our relationship, I traveled, not since the pandemic, but I'm returning back to traveling, and I travel a lot more than my husband does. But one of the things that we all as a family are really fond of is travel. And travel is one of the most beautiful ways to do the self-expansion, because the newness of circumstances, new ways of behaving, new demands on your thinking, new ways of emotional regulation needed because the context is new, can allow you to really explore that your limits of yourself, I guess, and then expand those limits. I'll tell you a cute story that for our a milestone 20th wedding anniversary, we decided to go to Paris, and we decided to take our kids as well. And what I did is I put together, by then I had been to Paris 4 times without my husband, and 2 times with him. And so that what I did is I put together a little book of curated artwork to see from 5 different museums. And I chose each art piece and gave a reason why. And then I created a reflection journal. This is a little too much, by the way. Nobody does that on their anniversary. It became a little class, but my husband is like, this is supposed to be romantic, not a lecture, No, but a workbook, yes. But my idea was to but one of the things that I was saying, can you guess why I loved this painting? And so it was really an exercise of seeing my perspective. And it was so cute because we had taken our boys who were teenagers, but it was everybody's perspective. It was kind of a knowing me, knowing you kind of exercise. And it was just something to bond over or just engage in this experience that was very unique. And I really have seen a great ways that we both have changed and grown closer because of such kind of experiences.
Yeah, and when you think
Can you
about,
comment one more thing that you said? Yeah.
oh, I was just going to say, what you're describing there is, you designed a new, interesting, and exciting activity. And so early in relationships, we have tons of those. We date all the time. We're doing all these kinds of fun activities together. Also, our partner is new and interesting because we don't know a lot about them. And so this is fundamentally why when our partner goes and does things without us, like when you went to Paris a bunch of times without your husband, you now came back with new and interesting information and experiences that you didn't have before. So he gets the benefit from it. And so, we have to kind of remember what the early stages of a relationship are like. And so what we've seen in our research on this is that when you experience more of this novelty, interesting, challenging, and exciting activities, it improves your passion, it improves your commitment, your satisfaction, relationship quality. It makes you less likely to cheat on your partner. It has all these great benefits that we don't often think of relationships as being this key source of self-expansion and personal growth, but they absolutely are. And, if we neglect it, if we're not getting sufficient amounts of personal growth, or doing Paris related workbooks, it can be a detriment to our relationship, and things can go poorly.
I love that. So, as we think about the proposition of, a lot of your writing is encouraging readers to introspect and investigate their own beliefs, and then make changes in their beliefs, attitudes, and eventually actions or dispositions, so to speak. From my work over past 20 years, this falls in the realm of metacognition, awareness of awareness, knowledge of self, knowledge of your knowledge. And there are a lot of barriers in that process, as we talked earlier. One of the components of metacognitive research that talks about is it has a tendency, particularly if you're laden with self-blindness, that it has a tendency to look inward and return with high self marks and saying that I'm pretty fabulous. What do you suggest for people with such predicament, or people who are dealing with people or who are married to or raising children with poor self knowledge, but they have very high self esteem about their knowledge, or they're pretty comfortable about their ignorance? What do you suggest we can do about that?
It's actually really funny because it's fundamentally why this book was called Stronger Than You Think. Because rather than trying to point out all the ways that people get it wrong, like this book could have been called the 10 ways you're wrong about relationships, right? But that's, for all the reasons you just mentioned, is too threatening to people. And so, instead it's your relationship's good, but here are ways that it's possibly better than you think. And so you kind of use people's inertia / momentum for you, and kind of help them move in the direction that you're hoping they go. And I think, I don't know, I feel with relationships, it's a little bit easier because we all fundamentally realize intuitively just how important they are. And so we all want to get it right. And so it's not a tough sell necessarily to convince people that, it's worthwhile to learn more about relationships so that you can experience better relationships. And so in that way, it's a little bit easier than trying to get people to change behaviors about their diet, right? Where it's like, junk food tastes so good. We want to have a really good relationship, and there's no reason learning what helps relationships should make them worse, right? There's just this just wouldn't make sense. And so, hopefully it's a little bit easier for people to be more convinced. At least, when I give talks in my class, it's popular, right? It's one of those things where people want this kind of information, or are really eager to learn these types of things. And it's one of the great joys of what I do is, hearing from students. Now I've been doing this a while, decades later, writing me emails and messages on social media about, just how much the information they learned from my class still helps them to this day. And so, that's what this book is. This book is, taking that class, any great class should change the way you think about the world, and make your life better. And so, rather than have to take 14-week class with, as my students would tell you, tests that are way too hard, you just, you can pick it up in a book and revisit it anytime you need.
I love that you're a true psychologist. So much of your message is full of optimism, but there's deep care for people's abilities and inabilities. And as you said, I didn't even think about that. You're meeting them where they are. So you're kind of saying stronger than you think means you already got so many ingredients going for you, and they're right, and they are full of potential. I just love that. It just occurred to me as I'm talking with you. So as we end, there's a one wonderful thing that you talk about is the when you know we no relationship is really permanent. And I know we are talking about intimate relationships and breaking, or a very close friend of mine, after 30 years of marriage, is going through divorce, and um, it's a big news for all of us, but very surprising news. We kind of there was no like telltale sign. So and when asked, she herself was blindsided by this decision. So I love that your last message talking about not really falling apart, even though it is very painful. Why do you say if we break up, I'll be broken is a myth? What's there to be sprung from a broken relationship?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally we mispredict just how bad we're going to feel after negative events, and particularly the research shows with breakup. And so, a bunch of researchers did what only researchers can do, and they asked people in relationships, if this relationship was going to end, with this person you're very much in love with, like how bad are you going to feel? And they gave a rating, and then the researchers followed them over the course of time and waited for them to actually break up, and then asked them again, how bad do you feel? Now, generally speaking, I mean, they felt bad, right? I mean, breakup is bad, right? I mean, everybody has those negative feelings, but it wasn't as bad as people thought it was going to be. And it really just speaks to our overwhelming resilience as people, right? We experience negative things all the time, but we actually, as much as we don't want to, we look at them and expect them to be bad, and in some ways they're not nearly as bad as we think, and we're much better at dealing with them than we thought we were. The other side of this is, when I say breakup doesn't have to leave you broken, it doesn't mean you're not going to experience any breakage, right? I mean, there's going to be parts of it that are bad. Even the very best breakups, there's guilt. I mean, there's always some bad. This just kind of speaks to human experience. Nothing is 100% good, and nothing is 100% bad. And so your breakup, as much as there are bad elements, if you look for the bad, you're going to find it. But if you look for the good things, those are there too. And so, as much as a 30-year relationship with someone ending in an unexpected way isn't great, it also now is an opportunity to find a new relationship that's likely to be better, because, if this relationship ended, it wasn't, it's something I say in my TED Talk, and it's in the book as well, is like, great relationships seldom fail, but the bad ones do, as they should. And that sounds, that as they should part can sound a little, thank you. It can sound a little harsh, but, the other thing I say, I think it's in the TED Talk too, is like, everybody deserves a great relationship. And so if you haven't found yours, keep looking. And so it's hard to find the great relationship you deserve if you're in one already. And so as much as a breakup, it's the ending of something, and that's hurtful and painful, and it has all those kinds of emotions that are wrapped up in it, it's also a chance for a new beginning. And so, don't lose sight of that.
Love that. Well, that just concept reminds me of a Japanese concept called wabi-sabi, which is a traditional Japanese aesthetics where you leave imperfections. So a pottery with cracks is considered a sign of the true nature of a life, which is imperfection. And I just love that, the way you described it. Well, thank you, Gary, for being on this podcast and sharing your wisdom and incredible hopefulness. As we come to an end, your book is going to be my top recommendations when I'm asked what book has influenced me. So, what a wonderful thinker like you, what influences your thinking? What has brought you joy in your reading? Can you recommend a few books for us?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, the number one book, and it's the easiest question for me to answer, is, the number one book for me is Tuesdays with Morrie.
I love
If
that.
you're familiar with it, it's about Mitch Albom is the author, and he's talking to his
Love
old
it.
college professor about who's dying, and so I, fundamentally what I am is a teacher, and so before every single semester, I read that book because it has nothing to do with
Wow.
teaching necessarily, but for me, it's a meditation on what's important in life and like how relationships are really it's the thing that underlies everything, and it's that connection to other people. That as much as I might teach a course on research methods, statistics, there are things that I
Love
teach
that.
that really what it's about is forming a relationship with students and like helping them live a better life. And so Tuesdays with Morrie is I mean, I practically have it memorized, I think, at this point, but
Wow.
it's a quick book, and it's something that just I don't know, can't get enough of it.
I love it. It's one of my favorites, but I've never thought about recommending that as a teacher student relationship. Of course. Wonderful. Any other? One more book?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of another good one for your audience. The other one that I have read several times that I like a lot is Start with Why by Simon Sinek. It's this
Yes,
idea that are you familiar with it? That
I
really
am. I am
you
very
to find
much.
your life purpose. Yeah, you find your life purpose, and he talks. It's really couched in business and how businesses have to figure out their why behind what they're doing, But I don't have a business, but I think of it as like this life philosophy is that if you have a good reason why you're doing things, right, then that becomes like this vision and sort of action plan for life that you want to have everything fit into that vision. Like what is your why in your professional life? What is your why in your as a parent? What is your why as a spouse? And so it gives you this kind of centering experience to identify and kind of once you've identified it, now you have this ability to kind of check in with yourself, and it forces
Mm,
this perspective where it's like if my why is to professionally for me, like my why is to use science to help people lead more fulfilling lives. And so am I doing that on a day-to-day basis? And I can kind of check in to see if I'm doing those things. And what I find is when I'm doing things that align with my why, I'm having a much better day, and I just feel better about what I'm doing. And so, like I said, he talks a lot about businesses, and he talks about the difference between like Apple and Dell, which is really all very interesting. But I think it's one of those concepts that very easily and obviously applies, particularly if you start thinking about all the kinds of roles you play in life, and if you adopt a why for each of those, it's like I said, it's very centering to me.
love that. Well, thank you so much, Gary, for being here with us. And podcast listeners, if you loved what you hear and you keep coming back, I know you do. I really appreciate that. And spread the joy, spread the word, leave us a review, like us on our social. And since Gary himself is a fan of Rumi's, I would love to end with a beautiful poem that goes like this: "This is how I would die, into the love I have for you. All pieces of cloud dissolve in sunlight." And that lightness with which that capacity to love somebody unconditionally, may all of you be gifted with that. Thank you for tuning in, and keep coming back. Thank you for being here with me, Gary, so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.